They said the wind never stopped in Black Hollow, and for Mercy Abernathy, that constant whisper across the plains was the only voice that had stayed faithful after the war took her father. The fever took her mother, and the law took her land. But on the day she buried the last of her students after a fire at the segregated mission school, she heard a different kind of voice, a deep, cracked baritone that sounded like the earth mourning itself, saying, "I want you to raise my daughter." And the man who said it was so tall he cast a shadow over half the cemetery and wore a wide-brimmed hat pulled low. But Mercy saw the tears on his cheeks anyway, and though she didn't know his name yet, she knew he carried a pain that could mirror her own. And when he handed her the small, soot-covered child with a scar along her collarbone and whispered, "Her name is Clover," Mercy didn't ask questions, because grief recognizes grief the way lightning finds iron. And in the weeks that followed, as Black Hollow's white leaders blamed Mercy for the fire and stripped her of her teaching post, her small home, and even her right to speak at town meetings, she stayed silent, not out of shame but calculation, for she'd learned during the war when she rode as a disguised scout with her father's Union regiment and used her uncanny gift for maps and memory to save hundreds of soldiers from Confederate traps. That silence is the most dangerous kind of intelligence. And she used that silence now to rebuild a school from the charred bones of the old one, this time underground in the limestone caves that snaked beneath the hills, where she taught the children of runaways, outcasts, and drifters by lantern light, and where Clover sat in the front, learning to read with such fierce hunger that Mercy sometimes forgot the world above was still hostile. Until the man returned, the giant, who called himself Reed Calder and said he was once a lawman, a bounty hunter, and finally, a husband to a Comanche woman who had been burned alive inside the schoolhouse by men he used to ride with, and Mercy listened without flinching as he spoke of betrayal, of blood-soaked trails, and of how Clover had survived only because she'd hidden in a whiskey barrel, and when he asked to stay near to help teach the children survival skills and sharpshooting, Mercy agreed, not because she trusted him yet, but because she saw in his eyes the same righteous fire her father had carried, the kind that burns slow but never dies. And together they created a haven so potent that word spread across counties, and by spring 30 children crowded the limestone benches. And Mercy's curriculum included botany, political history, secret code writing, and firearm mechanics. And they all knew, even the littlest ones, that they weren't just learning, they were preparing. And the moment came on a rainy June night when Deputy Silas Crane, once Mercy's suitor and now the town's de facto sheriff after hanging the last one for sympathizing, stormed the church above the caves with a posse of 12, intent on finding the devil's school. But what he found was an empty sanctuary and a note nailed to the pulpit that read, "The mind cannot be burned." And by the time he realized the students had slipped away, cloaked in mist and silence, the caves had already collapsed, deliberately triggered by Mercy and Reed using dynamite stolen from the rail company's depot, because Mercy had learned from war that victory is less about holding ground and more about forcing your enemy to waste time chasing ghosts. And while the posse searched the hills, the students regrouped 40 miles north in an abandoned ranch house, re-outfitted with supplies Reed had cached over the years. But their brief peace ended when a wounded telegraph operator staggered in one night and collapsed on Mercy's doorstep, whispering her father's name before he died. And in the papers he carried were drafts of a secret treaty, one that would evict every free black settler from the Western Territories under the guise of security reforms, authored by none other than Governor Thaddeus Brant, the same man who had once presented Mercy with a childhood medal for bravery after she pulled 3 children from a sinking riverboat. And as she read the cruel logic of the bill, her stomach turned to iron and she realized this wasn't just about education anymore. It was about survival on a national scale. So she wrote letters encoded in symbols only the Union's old ghost operatives would understand and sent them through traveling preachers while Reed rode to Fort Mason to meet with a cavalry captain who owed him a favor. And over the next month, Mercy orchestrated a resistance that spanned 4 states, using fugitive networks, native scouts, and disgruntled soldiers, until they had compiled a dossier that linked Brant to illegal land seizures Indian displacement, massacres, and the use of schools as traps to flush out mixed-race families for deportation. And the final piece of evidence came from an unlikely source, a bedridden white nun from the mission school fire, who, racked with guilt and morphine, confessed that the blaze had been set on orders from Brandt's office, not out of malice toward Mercy, but as a test to see if Reed Calder could be lured into vengeance and framed as a radical. And Mercy took this confession and placed it, along with the rest, into a single trunk, which she and Clover delivered by train to Washington, D.C., using fake names and disguises, and there, after 4 days of being ignored by clerks and secretaries, Mercy finally confronted Senator Hastings, a former abolitionist turned compromiser, and laid the trunk on his desk with a single sentence, "If you ignore this, I'll print it myself." And when Hastings opened the first folder and saw Governor Brandt's signature on an order to sell confiscated homesteads to a railroad company where he was silent partner, he sat back and murmured, "God help us," and 3 weeks later, federal marshals descended on Brandt's mansion. The headlines screamed of conspiracy and treason, and Mercy and Clover returned to Black Hollow to find the town divided, some calling her a hero, others a traitor, but all too ashamed to speak directly, and Reed stood waiting for her at the same graveyard where they first met, this time in front of a newly erected school building, one she hadn't approved, but now understood had been built by the townspeople as reparation and perhaps penance. And though she still bore the scars of rejection, she accepted the keys, not for herself, but for the children whose futures now depended on her strength. And when Clover ran to her, clutching a medal she'd earned for an essay contest about the right to learn, Mercy felt, for the first time in years, the wind changed direction, not whispering warnings anymore, but promises, and she looked at Reed, whose eyes had aged but softened, and said quietly, "It's time," and he nodded, knowing exactly what she meant. And as the sun rose over Black Hollow's hills, painting the schoolhouse in gold, Mercy rang the new bell, and its sound echoed not just through the town, but through the very heart of a nation trying desperately to remember what justice sounded like.